All right, in chapter 21, we'll be looking at the respiratory system. And in this part of the video, I want to look at the physiology, the functioning of the system. We'll look at the anatomy portion during the lab part of the class. The primary function for the respiratory system is respiration. But there's more detail that goes into respiration than most people realize. And so there's really four main parts of respiration, which are listed here. The first one is ventilation. That's what most people think of when you hear the term respiration, is actually what's called ventilation, which is moving air in and out of the lungs. You take in a breath, you exhale a breath, inhale, exhale. But that's not all there is to respiration. So for example, gas exchange is part of the process of respiration as well. So number two under respiration is pulmonary gas exchange. That's exchanging air inside of the lungs. And so you're trying to get the oxygen into the blood there in the lungs, and you're trying to exhale to get out the carbon dioxide. But again, that's not all of respiration. Part three says transport of oxygen, carbon dioxide in the blood. And so part of respiring, or part of breathing, is actually making sure that those gases are transported properly through the bloodstream. And then lastly, number four, tissue gas exchange, getting that oxygen out to the tissues, or tissue perfusion where it needs to go, oxygen out to the tissues, and then getting the carbon dioxide to leave the tissues, get back into the blood so that you can transport that up back up to the lungs. So all four of these processes are essential for respiration. Now, other functions that are part of the respiratory system include balancing your pH. And we've talked about before that the blood pH should be between 7.35 and 7.45. Well, it's critical with this system to help balance that pH because you're balancing carbon dioxide levels. And as we'll see later on, CO2 levels cause, if you have elevated CO2 levels, that leads to a decrease in the pH or the acidity levels go up. And so that's very critical to balance your CO2 levels. Number two is production of a chemical called ACE. This stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. So in this little pathway here, which we'll look at in more detail when we get to the urinary system, this pathway begins with a chemical or a hormone called renin that's produced from the kidneys. And this actually works like an enzyme to drive forward a chemical from the liver to produce angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by this chemical from the lungs called angiotensin converting enzyme. In turn, that leads to a production of this angiotensin 2 to go to the adrenal gland, to the cortex, where it releases aldosterone. Aldosterone helps you to retain sodium ions, and so your sodium levels stay elevated, and so that allows you to retain fluids, and that helps to balance your blood volume, your body fluids, your blood volume, and your blood pressure. Three is voice production, movement of air past the vocal cords or the vocal folds that are located in the voice box or the larynx. Four, the sense of smell, that's called olfaction, and that's because of the sensory receptors that reside in the nasal cavity. And then five, protection. You have specialized structures in the respiratory system to try to prevent entry of microorganisms into the system, such as hairs and ciliated cells and mucus. And then you have a cough reflex, and that mucus that tries to help remove microorganisms from respiratory surfaces. Now, when you're looking at the respiratory tubules and the bronchial tubes, we need to talk about what's called the respiratory membrane. And so in the diagram here, you see the trachea coming down, splitting off into the bronchial tubes, going into the lungs, and then at the end of these bronchial tubes, you come to where the alveolar air sacs are located. This is where gas exchange is taking place inside of the lungs, and that's because you have capillaries, pulmonary capillaries, that line and go right around the edges of these air sacs. So this is where you have what's called the respiratory membrane. So if you enlarge this, you're going to find that you have this little square right here is what's called the respiratory membrane area. So this is like looking at one air sac, one airspace inside of the lungs. You've got the kind of a cross section here of the capillaries that are surrounding it, the pulmonary capillaries that are surrounding it. And so this is where gas exchange is taking place. You take a deep breath in, you've got oxygen that fills up these air sacs, and now you got to get the oxygen from inside of the air sac across the respiratory membrane into the bloodstream. And then you have to get the carbon dioxide from the bloodstream across the same respiratory membrane back into that air sac so that when you exhale, you can get rid of the CO2. Well, you'll find three different types of cells located in and around the, right around this respiratory membrane. The main type is what's called a type 1 pneumocyte. It's basically epithelial cells, relatively thin, squamous epithelial cells. They need to be thin because that's where gas exchange is taking place. So you don't want a very thick cell here because you want to maximize how much gas exchange is taking place between the air sac and the bloodstream. They make up about 90% of the alveolus or the air sac, and they allow for gas exchange to take place. So these are called type 1 pneumocytes, type 1 lung cells. The second type you have, type 2 lung cell or pneumocyte, is actually a gland type cell. It's a cuboidal shaped gland cell, secretory cell. Most of your gland cells usually are cube shaped. This is relatively cube shaped here. Type 2 pneumocyte. And this produces a chemical we'll talk about a little later called surfactant. It basically helps to control the surface tension or to limit the surface tension inside of the air sac. It turns out you have a little bit of a fluid layer inside. We'll mention that in a minute. That surrounds this air sac. Well, one property of water is that it creates surface tension. And so by having the right amount of surface tension is important. If you have too much, that creates too much tension on the inside, and that causes it to be very hard to expand your lungs. And so you need this chemical to help regulate or limit the amount of surface tension on the inside of your air sac. Now, the third type of cell you're going to find is just a macrophage, a phagocytic type cell. These are macrophages or monocytes. As they start out in the bloodstream, they migrate to the lungs. And so you have some resident immune system cells here, macrophages, that reside inside of the air sacs. And so usually they call these dust cells because that's kind of what they do, is they get rid of foreign particulate matter that maybe you have inhaled, including dust or cell debris, or perhaps even some kind of bacterial cell that makes its way inside of the air sac area. So you do have a little bit of immune protection inside of your lung cells. Now let's take a closer look at this respiratory membrane. There's really 6 main layers to the membrane that oxygen and carbon dioxide have to diffuse across in order to go through gas exchange. And so this little box here you see at the bottom of the slide shows you the respiratory membrane, and on this kind of extreme left, this is what it would look like on the inside of the air sac. And then on the bottom right, you see the capillary again with the red blood cell here. So you're trying to get gas exchange going back and forth across, trying to get oxygen to diffuse from the blood into the air, oxygen to diffuse from the air sac into the bloodstream, and trying to get CO2 to diffuse out of the blood into the air sac so that you can exhale that and get rid of it. Well, you have 6 different layers, and these 6 layers are listed in the order from inside the air sac to the capillary. So let's start on the inside. So here's your air, here's your oxygen. Let's say you just take a deep breath. You got all this oxygen in your lungs. It's inside of the air sac, the alveolus. The first thing it's going to have to pass through in order to diffuse into the bloodstream is a thin layer of fluid, just a water-based fluid that's here. Remember, you're going to have a little bit of the surfactant here to try to make sure you're kind of keeping that surface tension in check. But you go through the fluid first. Then you're going to come to that type 1 pneumocyte. Remember, you got to go through the type 1 pneumocyte to get to the other side of the air sac here. And so that's just listed up here as alveolar epithelium. It's basically your simple squamous type 1 pneumocyte. The gas has to go through that actual cell. Well, if you remember from 168, epithelial tissue basically sits. It's, whether you have simple squamous or whatever type you have. In this case, we have simple squamous. It's going to sit on top of a layer, mainly protein, called a basement membrane, or the basal layer. And so you got to go through that. And so that's indicated here in purple. You've got a little thin layer, that's a basement membrane. So gas has to go across that. Then you have a very small space that's just called interstitial space, like an air pocket of space that the gas is going to have to diffuse across. And then you got to go through kind of the same scenario on the other side of the air sac, because if you remember, the capillaries are basically epithelial cells. And so, so you got to go through that basement membrane that lines the epithelial cell of the capillary. And then you got to go through the actual capillary cell itself, which is another simple squamous type of epithelial. And of course, they usually use the term endothelial when you talk about the blood vessels, the capillary, because they kind of face on the inside, and so they just call these endothelial cells. They're basically epithelial cells on the inside of a structure. So 6 layers of the respiratory membrane to exchange gases. Gases diffuse across these 6 layers. Now, in section 3, we want to talk about the actual process of breathing or ventilation, moving air into and out of the lungs. That's your definition again for ventilation. And we need to talk about several gas laws and properties of gases, beginning with the first one, that air wants to go from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And so as we go through, we're going to look at several different gas laws and properties to try to help explain how are you actually breathing, how are you actually moving air in and out of the lungs. So the first thing we had to realize is air always goes from a high pressure to low pressure. Second thing we need to realize is something called Boyle's law. And if you've had some chemistry before, you may have seen this gas pressure law. The equation is listed here for you. P is pressure, is equal to K over V. K is a constant, and V is volume. So pressure, one way to look at this is that pressure is the opposite of volume. Pressure is inversely proportional to volume, is better said that way. In other words, pressure and volume are inverses. What that really means is if one changes, if one goes up, the other one must go down. The K, for our purposes, we're just not going to worry about the K for now. That's a constant at a given temperature. Now, K is important if you change temperatures, right? So the pressure of a gas does change in different temperatures. And so, the higher the temperature, the warmer the air, the higher the temperature, the faster the air molecules are moving. And so that's going to have higher pressure. But for our purposes, we're just looking at, breathing in and out. We're not really going to discuss changing temperatures really at the moment. So we're just looking at what is the relationship between pressure and volume. And the main thing here is that they have an opposite relationship. One goes up, the other one goes down. So let's look at some other things to kind of help explain ventilation. Now, the same two properties are listed up here at the top. Air goes from high pressure to low pressure, and the pressure is inversely proportional to volume. That's our Boyle's law. But let's think about this. If atmospheric pressure or barometric pressure is greater than the pressure inside your air sacs, your alveolar pressure, then that's going to force air into your air sacs. All right, that's basically what that first observation was. Air goes from high pressure to low pressure. So if the atmospheric pressure on the outside of the body, is higher than the pressure inside your lungs, then that's going to mean air is going to go inside your lungs. Well, you can't change really atmospheric pressure, right? You're just sitting in a room, so you can't change atmospheric pressure, but you can change the pressure inside of your lungs. To do that, though, you have to change the volume. And so to change the volume inside of your lungs, you change your thoracic cavity size, and that's through the help of some of your muscles inside of the body, including the diaphragm. So let's look at some figures, some diagrams to kind of see how this would work. So in this figure, you see the chest cavity. This is the lungs. This is like your bronchial tubes coming in, bringing air in. This is outside, barometric pressure, or the pressure outside of the body. And this would be the pressure inside of your air sacs. And then at the bottom of the lungs, you would find the diaphragm. Now, one thing about the diaphragm is that it is a relatively curved muscle in its relaxed position. So when you're relaxed, when you're not breathing, the diaphragm is kind of curved like this. But whenever you take a breath, what the diaphragm does to help you take a breath is that it contracts, and when it contracts, it pushes down. So watch this next slide. During a breath, the diaphragm contracts, it expands downward. That means the volume inside of your thoracic cavity actually goes up. Volume increases. And so if you go back to our Boyle's law equation, if volume goes up, that means the pressure is going to go down inside the thoracic cavity. All right, so take a second, kind of think about that. If volume has increased, that's what we did when we contracted the diaphragm. We made the volume inside the thoracic cavity increase, and that decreases the pressure on the inside. And so in this particular diagram, they represent this with not really true numbers, but just some kind of numbers kind of get the idea here, is that they show this as a negative. Remember before they showed zero pressure outside and zero pressure inside. Again, these are not actual numbers of the air pressure. They just said, well, let's say, for example, that it's, zero on the outside, zero on the inside. So that means air is not moving either direction. But whenever your diaphragm contracts, that increases the volume, it decreases the pressure, and they represent that by saying, well, there's a negative pressure inside. Still, the atmospheric pressure hasn't changed. That's why it's still zero. The bottom line, though, is there's greater atmospheric pressure here outside than there is inside. And so we said that air is going to move from high pressure to low pressure. So when your diaphragm contracts, it increases the volume, decreases the pressure inside the lungs, and air wants to move inside of your lungs. After you stop, after you inhale and you stop, pressure's balanced back out. So it's zero outside, zero inside. At this point, you're basically holding your breath, right? Your diaphragm's not moving. You're not expanding the chest cavity. Everything's kind of stationary. You're holding your breath. But to exhale, your diaphragm has to relax. Diaphragm relax, it goes back into position. It decreases the volume here. And because Boyle's law says they're going to, pressure and volume are going to be inversely related. If you decrease the volume, you increase the pressure. And so now pressure is going up inside of your thoracic cavity. Pressure goes up and it forces air out of the lungs. So these two laws, again, pressure, air goes from high pressure to low pressure, and Boyle's law, pressure and volume are inversely related, help to explain ventilation. Now, a couple other things associated with ventilation is something called lung recoil. It's important that our lungs stretch, but then they have to go back into shape. They have to recoil like elastic tissue does. It has to recoil. And so that's a tendency, lung recoil is a tendency for lungs to actually get smaller, decrease in size after you stretch them out. So after you take a deep breath, you have to allow the lungs to recoil. Well, to help that, you have two main things. You have elastic fibers, elastic protein fibers that are inside of the air sacs, and that helps to bring the tissue back smaller, helps it to recoil. But again, that surface tension that I was talking about earlier, you have that fluid on the inside of that respiratory membrane. That fluid is a water-based fluid, and because of the properties of water, that fluid kind of pulls on itself and it tries to draw in the air sacs. If you left it up to its own, it would draw it in too much. In other words, you have to have this surfactant, like we mentioned earlier by the type 2 pneumocytes, to try to reduce how much surface tension you have so that you don't actually collapse those little air sacs. Now let's look at a few factors that will help influence this ventilation process. Well, several of the factors are pretty standard, such as airway resistance. If you have a more open airway, it's going to be easier to move air in and out versus a constricted airway. And so these terms are up here for you. Bronchodilation, whenever the airways are, you have some smooth muscle wrapped around your bronchial tubes. Whenever they're relaxed, it allows the bronchial tubes to dilate or open up, and you can have less airway resistance, and that allows you to have, easier breathing, easier ventilation. If that smooth muscle contracts, then that decreases the diameter, and that causes more resistance, and that makes it more difficult to breathe. And so, individuals that have asthma may need a bronchodilator, and that helps to relax these smooth muscles that hopefully will help to relax the bronchial tubes and allow air to move in and out more freely. Now, another factor that influences pulmonary ventilation is how much surface tension there is. Again, kind of mentioned that a couple times already. The more surface tension there is, or the less surfactant that you have, the more that air sac is going to collapse or just prevents it from expanding like it needs to. So if you don't have the surfactant, all these little water molecules here, they form hydrogen bonds. That's just a property of water, and it kind of tightens in that membrane there, and it starts to collapse. It doesn't allow it to expand, so it doesn't fill up with the amount of air that it needs to. Versus with the surfactant kind of gets in between those water molecules, so it doesn't allow for those hydrogen bonds to form, and allows that air sac, the alveolus, to inflate properly. And there's something known as pulmonary compliance. Now, we saw compliance when we looked at vessel stretching. It's the same word, it's just used here for the lungs. The pulmonary compliance is the ability of lungs and your chest cavity to actually stretch. And so you need that to happen so that you can expand your lungs, and so that Boyle's law can work properly inside of your lungs, so you can increase and decrease the volume in your chest cavity so that you can change the pressure and actually ventilate properly. And so the amount of pulmonary compliance or stretchability is determined by three main things. One is the degree of how much surface tension you have. Again, if you have too much surface tension, it's going to be difficult to stretch out your lungs. How stretchable, or technically it's called distensibility, how elastic your elastic tissue is inside of your lungs. If you lose some of that elasticity inside of your lungs, it's going to be difficult to stretch out your lungs. It's going to be difficult to take a deep breath. And that happens. Sometimes it happens as we age. Sometimes there are diseases that accelerate the process. So if you've heard of something called pulmonary fibrosis, some of the lung tissue that should be elastic is replaced with scarring tissue. And that tissue isn't elastic anymore. And so if you lose that elasticity, you start to limit the ability to ventilate properly. And then, the ability to move your chest wall, if you have something that restricts you from breathing physically, it could be a muscle problem, it could be an injury. If you have something that restricts your chest wall from being able to move in and out, then that's going to limit your pulmonary compliance.